All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction, Alex, and the invitation to present today. So I am a senior scientist in FDA's Devices Center within our Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories. That's a office within FDA's Devices Center where we focus on regulatory science research, as opposed to being the office that does the actual review of device submissions. Though we also support the device submission review as well. So we developed this guidance assessing the credibility of computational modeling and simulation in medical device submissions over the last few years and released it in November last year. It builds upon the ASME V&V40 guidance that hopefully most of you heard about on Friday. I'll try and provide an introduction to that a little bit in case you missed the Friday session, but if you did, I encourage you to view the recording when it's available. As the guidance builds upon that, I'm going to talk about the aims of the guidance, why we felt that it needed to generalize the V&V40 framework, and also talk about how modeling is used in FDA device submissions in general. So I'll start off with a quick disclaimer. Mention of any commercial products, their sources, or use in connection with material reported herein is not to be construed as an actual or implied endorsement of such products by the Department of Health and Human Services and the US government. And we'll start off by talking about what exactly is computational modeling and simulation. But actually, I suppose before we get into that, I should provide a little bit more of an introduction to myself. So it's very nice to be presenting in a UK event again. So I grew up in the north of England, studied maths in Cambridge, and then moved into biological modeling through my PhD and postdoctorate research in Oxford before moving to the US about just a little bit over 10 years ago. What was expected to be a couple of years that turned into something much longer. I moved to the US for a project related to cardiac modeling, which is where I've done a lot of work in. But at the time of moving to FDA and the Devices Center in FDA, there was an increasing interest in when can we trust computational modeling and simulation. So it became a topic that was of a lot of interest to me, and I've spent my career in FDA on that topic. So let's start by talking about what we actually mean by computational modeling and simulation. And this figure talks about two different types of computational, let's say computational technology or mathematical model. And on the left-hand side, sorry, let's start with the right-hand side. Right-hand side are what I'm calling first principles models, sometimes called knowledge-based models, or physics-based models, or mechanistic models. Models where they are based on assumed truths about the system of interest. And so you can develop governing equations based on, say, physical principles. And that's an image of Isaac Newton, who postulated the force equals mass times acceleration, which forms the basis of many of these models, the models that are used to simulate the deformation of a solid body or flow in a fluid. Then on the left-hand side, the left-hand side, there's what I'm calling data-driven models. So these include statistical fitting methods, but also includes modern machine learning, neural networks, and AI, if you consider AI to be that left-hand side. AI is a bit of a fuzzy term. Sometimes people use AI much more broadly to include all of this. But when I say AI, I'm going to be thinking of data-driven models. This is the spectrum, though. There are models that draw from both first principles and data-driven. In fact, most first principle models need some kind of data-driven subcomponent to close the system. But also other possibilities can be generated, such as it's increasingly common to develop a computationally expensive first principles model, say a fluid flow model or a solid mechanics model that simulates how a body will deform. And then, because that's very expensive to run, you can, instead of running a new simulation each time you can try to collect a kind of library of simulation results and train a machine learning model to that. Then there's something called physics-informed neural networks and other related machine learning technologies that basically try and bring these two types of models together, types of methodologies together. So what do we mean by computational modeling and simulation? Well, that's basically a synonym for first principles models. So either the pure first principles models on the right-hand side or the first principles models within the hybrid methods. And that's the scope of the guidance. So although it is going to be a general guidance, and you'll see as we talk about it that there's aspects of it that could be applicable to AI, to machine learning models and data-driven models, we explicitly stay in the guidance scope section that the scope of the guidance is intended to be just first principle models or first principles based components of hybrid models. So standalone statistical or data-driven models are of scope. So what people usually think of as AI is out of scope, so generative AI is out of scope. But also out of scope are things like models with no simulation. So just purely anatomical models where there's no prediction being made about function or disease progression, for example. Then, as I mentioned, it's a general guidance. It's going to talk about how we assess credibility of models, but it doesn't provide any information on how to perform the actual modeling studies. And some of the technical details related to the specific tasks of things like verification, validation, and setting quantification, and I'll define those momentarily. Some of the technical details for that are also out of the scope of the guidance. There's a big literature on that. The V&V40 standard, which we build upon, covers that. So we don't go into that kind of level of detail. And then, because it is a very general guidance, the specific level of credibility needed for any particular regulatory submission is also not something that we aim to provide in the guidance. And that's unfortunate. I think everyone wants to be able to pick up a document that says, okay, if you do this, if you're going to use a model for this particular task, then these are the 20 things that you need to do. And you check them off, and then you're happy. And then everyone's happy. But that may be possible for specific types of device and specific models, but it's not possible to write that across the board for all models. Certainly all the types of models that we kind of receive in the medical devices center at FDA. So we don't aim to do that, but we more provide a framework. Let's talk about how computational modeling and simulation is actually used in device regulatory submissions. On the left-hand side is the traditional application, the most established application, where we have a computational model of a device that's developed that can then be simulated to predict, to address some kind of question of interest about the device. It's generally going to be a question about the safety of the device or an effectiveness question, because industry, when they submit information to FDA, they need to show that their device is safe or effective. So this is a picture, there's a couple of pictures of a orthopedic implant and a cardiovascular stent. And for those types of devices, one question that's very important is, will these devices fracture after implantation? They're lifelong implants. They need to not fracture, and that's a difficult question to address, and it's something that's typically addressed with bench testing, but can be also addressed or complemented with computational modeling. Then the second of the four here is completely different. This is where computational modeling algorithms are implemented within device software. So in the first case, industry would be running the model to simulate, to predict something about the device, and then providing that information to us, FDA, to review. In the second case, the modeling is actually within the software, and so FDA has to review how reliable that model is going to be when it's used in the field, in the hospital or the clinic. In this case, we're really talking about things like patient-specific modeling and digital twins. I'm not going to talk too much about digital twins, but that's a kind of area of increasing interest. It's a bit of a buzzword, and it's also, like AI, not used very consistently. But if you consider a digital twin as a computational model of a patient that continually takes data or is kind of continually updated with patient data, then a digital twin needs as a basis some kind of patient-specific model. And these patient-specific models are typically developed generated within these software tools by taking in imaging data, and then they make patient-specific predictions. And an example is the HeartFlow device that uses CT images, generates a patient-specific model of the coronary vasculature, and provides information to the clinician about the level of blockage to coronary arteries. Another example is the Cardio Insight device. The HeartFlow device is a purely software device. Cardio Insight is a physical device with modeling software as part of the device. So there, the patient wears this vest, which has a lot of electrodes that can take recordings of the body surface electrical potential. And then the modeling software solves basically an inverse problem to predict what the electrical activity on the heart is, or what I should have said is then the patient undergoes, I think, CT imaging so that a patient-specific model of the heart and torso can be generated, and then the software tries to predict what the electrical activity on the heart is just from the body surface recording. So it's basically a tool for non-invasive electrical mapping of the heart activity. The third case is a kind of emerging area for computational modeling and simulation, something that we call in silico clinical trials. So the terminology is used, I think different terms are used for that sometimes. And this kind of goes back to the first case with the model of a device, but couples it to a model of patients, couples it to a range of models of patients. So you can try and replicate a real clinical trial, but entirely in silico in the computational framework, and address the kind of same kind of questions that you would address with a real clinical trial. This is different to the first case because it requires not just device models, but a range of patient models, and raises a lot of questions about reliability. As I mentioned, it's a kind of new area that there's research in. It's not established yet. At the bottom, I mentioned these things for 510K, PMA, De Novo, IDE, HDE. Those are all types of regulatory submission for a particular device or to initiate a clinical trial. So these first three cases are all about single devices. We also have something called MDDTs, which are medical device development tools. And these are tools that organizations, not necessarily device developers, but any kind of organization can submit to FDA, or submit to CDRH, the Devices Center, submit a tool that they claim is going to be useful for medical device industry to evaluate their devices. So some kind of tool that can be used on a range of devices to address some kind of safety or effectiveness question. And then FDA will qualify the device, which means that we look at the information about, qualify the MDDT, which means we look at the how the MDT is supposed to be used and what kind of information it provides and the evidence supporting its reliability. And then if we qualify it, we say that we believe this can be used to evaluate devices, and we won't need to ask any questions about the methodology if it's used in the regulatory submission. We'll just look at the results. And obviously a model could be submitted as an MDDT. A timeline on how this kind of field has evolved in the last 15 years. In the early 2010s, there was a growing awareness in the devices community, including in CDRH, the Devices Center at FDA, for the need for standardized credibility assessment. Before that, modeling and simulation was already established in certain areas like such as assessing fracture risk, or another very well established area is assessing the potential for tissue heating and thermal damage when a patient who has a metallic implant undergoes MR imaging, because those kind of metallic implants can absorb energy when you do MRI, and that can be deposited in the tissue and lead to damage and potential internal burning. Obviously, a huge safety question, huge safety concern, hard to assess through clinical trials or experiments, and something that's evaluated using models and has been for a very long time. But in the early 2010s, the center realized that we're going to start seeing an increasing use of models. They were very prescient, really, to understand that it's going to explode, and we needed to think more deeply about when can we trust a computational model. So FDA has played a leading role in efforts since then. FDA was involved in the formation and led the ASME V&V40 subcommittee. That's the subcommittee that we heard about Friday, that 5 years later released the V&V40 Standard. A couple of years before that, in 2016, we released the first model-specific guidance from the center, and this was a guidance on reporting of simulation studies. So it does touch a little bit about credibility, but it's really on what kind of information industry should submit if you submit a simulation study, and it's really focused on this first case, in silico device testing, as opposed to the other cases. And actually, Kenny Aycock from FDA will be talking about that one tomorrow. In 2020, we formalized our credibility and modeling efforts into a research program, a regulatory science program. And then in 2021, after a couple of years of working on it, we developed this guidance that we released in draft, received a lot of great public comments, and then revised it, and the final guidance came out in November 2023. So some key definitions that hopefully will be familiar to most of you from last Friday. Credibility is based on is defined as the trust based on all available evidence on the predictive capability of computational model for a particular context of use. And the context of use is defined as the role and scope of the computational modeling in answering the question of interest. And then the key activities that we use to establish credibility are two things called verification and validation. And these have very specific meanings in the computational modeling world. They're somewhat different to V&V of software or processes, somewhat different to how verification is often used in the pharmacological world, and also somewhat different to how validation data is used for machine learning. So it's unfortunate that there's kind of these differences how communities use these terms. It's very unfortunate. It leads to confusion, and it leads to challenges in harmonization. But that is the situation, unfortunately. So verification for computational models, and this is terms that have been established a long time ago. We are building a lot on what the traditional engineering communities of aerospace, aviation, automobile have been, what those communities, and nuclear, are those communities which have been using computational modeling for a long time in safety critical applications and relying on computational modeling. So they, for many years, have been using these and have developed processes and for ensuring that those models are reliable. And so the medical device community has been drawing from that. Verification basically asks, is a computational model an accurate implementation of an underlying mathematical model? And a mathematical model is basically the equations that you have written down in paper. Computational model is basically what you are able to run on a computer. And so, is it implemented correctly? And what is the numerical error? Because usually with the mathematical models that we're working with, which are ordinary and partial differential equations, then you need to introduce some kind of discretization, and that leads to some numerical error. So there's two kind of related questions for verification: code verification and calculation verification, which I won't go into in detail, but I'll refer you to the previous talk. Then validation asks, is the computational model an accurate representation of the real world? And that's where you now need to bring in experimental data or clinical data and actually do some kind of comparison to the real world to see whether the computational model, which is going to be a mixture of your assumptions, your parameters, and your numerical implementation, does it provide predictions that align with what we observe in the real world? So V&V40 was a milestone event for the community in 2018. This is the first general framework for evaluating computational models. It is a risk-informed framework. So basically, it asks users to first assess the risk associated with using the computational model for your particular medical device application, and then use that to determine how credible the model needs to be. So it starts off by asking users to state the question of interest. What's the model going to be used for? And this should be some kind of question about the system of interest, the patient or the device. It shouldn't be a question about the actual model. What are we trying to use the model to answer that we would otherwise use some other source of information? Then it asks users to define the context of use, which is how exactly the model is going to be used to answer that question. And then it asks users to assess model risk, and basically asks users to evaluate two factors: decision consequence and model influence. So consequences basically asks, if you made a mistake with your question of interest, let's say your question of interest is is the device resistant to fracture? If you made a mistake, what would the consequence be? Would it be some kind of minor consequence to a patient? Because typically the decision consequence is some kind of related to an adverse event for the patient. Would it be minor? Would it require hospitalization? Could it lead to death? And then it asks users to assess the model influence. That's the y-axis. And that basically asks, how much are we reliant on the model to answer this question of interest? Are we only using the model, or is the model supplementary to some experimental data? And then once the model risk is assessed, then the standard basically leads the user through a range of credibility factors. Here there's 13 credibility factors. Actually, in reality, there's a few more in V&V40 because many of these are broken down into sub-factors. I think there's 23 altogether. And these are specific considerations related to the verification of the model or the validation of the model, or something called applicability, which asks, how relevant are your validation activities to the context of use? Because with medical devices, or in general, when you evaluate a computational model, you have one context of use, which is what you're going to make predictions about, and then you validate. But there's going to be differences. Some big differences, for example, is that you want to make predictions about pediatric patients, but you only validate with adult patients using adult clinical data. Or another big difference is you want to make clinical predictions about patients, but you only validate against animal data. So applicability asks, how relevant is the validation, other validation results to the actual context of use? And the credibility factors are these specific considerations. You can see them on the right-hand side column: software quality assurance, verification, discretization error, and so on. And V&V40 basically lays out 23 different credibility factors for users to consider and turn and asks users to come up with some kind of gradation, and it provides example gradations for the user to help for each of these that basically go from low level of rigor to high level of rigor, and users can then kind of justify the level of rigor for each of these based on the risk assessment. We'll actually go into that in a little bit more detail, all of these stages in a little more detail in the guidance when we go through the guidance. Some key points about the guidance itself. It's completely consistent with the standard. It provides a framework that's also risk informed, and if you do follow the standard, then you will have adhered to the guidance, except there's kind of like one or two extra things to consider. And that means the guidance has an emphasis on question of interest, context of use, and model risk, just like the standard. The guidance provides a general framework for model credibility assessment that's intended to be applicable to all models, at least all first principles models, not driven AI/ML, all applications, solid mechanics, fluid flow, electromagnetism, physiological modeling, and any kind of device-related question for any of those models, and all types of regulatory submission, whether that's for initiating a clinical trial, a 510K, or a PMA regulatory submission, if you know what those are. It's supposed to be applicable to all of these cases. And that means it's very general and not prescriptive. It extends the approach of V&V40, as I said, but then there's a question of why. And that is basically, it's motivated by the fact that V&V40 kind of implicitly assumes that you have a model of the device. Some of the terminology in the standard kind of implies that it's a model of a device, and that it will be possible to evaluate that model against well-controlled bench test experiments. This picture here is an experiment that might be performed to evaluate a computational model of the absorbed energy that a metallic implant might of a metallic implant during MR imaging. So in many cases, it will be possible to do prospective bench tests, well-controlled bench tests to validate a device-related model, but in many cases, that's not what will be done. There's a wider range of possibilities. So we wanted to cover that in the guidance. Don't try and look at the specific text in this figure. It's taken directly from the guidance. It's figure 1 in the guidance. I've included it here to show how, because we're going to go through it, each of these different steps, and I've included it to relate it to the guidance itself. So if you refer to the guidance afterwards, you'll see how what we're going to go through in the next few minutes or so is related to that figure. So these are the 9 steps in this framework. We'll go through them in turn. The blue ones at the beginning are these preliminary steps that are actually very well aligned with V&V40, state question of interest, context of use, and assess model risk. Then there's some steps that generalize V&V40 a little bit, and then something at the end, towards the end, called adequacy assessment. That is a kind of a new step that we introduced to ask manufacturers to provide a kind of overall rationale for credibility. So let's start with these initial steps. First step is state the question of interest. Already kind of gone through this for V&V40, but the question of interest is, what is the specific question, decision, or concern that's being addressed? As I mentioned, it should be about the real world and not the model. Some extra, in the guidance, we refer to V&V40, but we provided any kind of extra considerations that we thought were important to make clear, either because based on our experience with the use of V&V40, which was obviously released kind of 5 years before the guidance, there were some things that could be clarified, or specific considerations that were relevant to regulatory submissions. So one of the things that we emphasize in the guidance is that this question of interest should not be overly broad, not something like, is the device safe, but the specific question that the model is going to be used to address. So example, is the device resistant to fatigue fracture under anticipated worst case radial loading conditions for this cardiovascular stent, or for that cardio insight device that I described earlier, what is the question of interest in this patient model? What is the electrical activity on the heart epicardial surface? Step 2 is state the context of use, which is the role and scope of the computational model in answering the question of interest. So this should be a paragraph or a few paragraphs describing what exactly is modeled and how model outputs are used to answer the question of interest. So type of model, key inputs and key outputs. And it should also say whether any other information will be used to answer the question of interest. Will the model be combined with bench test data or animal clinical data, or will it be the only source of information? And here, it's worth kind of considering the two different cases. For device testing, where you're going to provide, where a company will be providing simulation study results, the context of use is going to be how will the what was done and what evidence has been provided, modeling and other, and the context of use could be combined with computational modeling predictions and empirical fatigue testing observations to estimate device fatigue safety factors under anticipated worst case radio loading conditions, and the ... implies that there'll be a lot more information typically needed to be provided. Device software function, the context of use is actually when the device is used on the patient, and often, well, sometimes the device might be the only source of information provided to a clinician. Sometimes it might be one source of information. Sometimes the device output, the model related device output will be will directly impact the therapy on the patient. So that's something that needs to be stated as part of the context of use. Then there's the model risk assessment. V&V40 defines model risk as the possibility that a computational model simulation results may lead to an incorrect decision that would lead to an adverse outcome. I already talked about the two factors, decision consequence and model influence. Just happens that the axes have been swapped in this figure. Typically, when we assess model risk, we assess, first of all, well, influence on some kind of gradation from low to high, and then decision consequence on also on some kind of gradation from low to high, maybe with intermediate as well. And for decision consequence, we emphasize in the guidance that they should be related to the kind of formal risk assessment that's needed to be done for a medical device following, for example, the ISO 14971 guidance standard. It's not related to the full risk assessment for a device, but it's related to the risk assessment. It should be based on the risk related to the specific question that you're going to address. So we recommend referring to ISO 14971, which actually breaks it down further and asks users to first identify harms, potential hazards, and then harms, potential harms, and then consider both the probability of occurrence of that harm and the severity of that harm. And then that's converted into a final possible decision consequence, which could range from minor patient inconvenience to serious injury or death. The model influence, for example, could range from some computational modeling being used in combination with test data, or that the model is the only source of information. And as I mentioned, these two things are really for the case of in silico device testing. If instead it's a model in device software, then the model influence could range from relatively low if it was very clearly stated in the indications for use that the model-based outcome should not be relied upon, and the clinician it's based on the clinician's overall judgment. So really, if a model is being used to predict information, that's clearly a significant factor in the influence. Or there's other cases where a software device or a medical device with computational modeling software directly impacts, like I said, directly impacts the therapy, in which case the computational model might have a kind of controlling influence. Now we get to these intermediate steps that are basically, we introduce something new that's different to V&V40, and this is this concept of credibility evidence. So the next few slides are going to talk about why we introduced that concept and how we went about providing a categorization of credibility evidence. Credibility evidence is basically defined in the guidance as any evidence that could support the credibility of a computational model. So anything that could conceivably be provided in a regulatory submission to support the credibility. Typically, verification and validation results, but we provide a categorization that kind of breaks that down a little bit more, and also provide some cases that not strictly verification and validation, but could still support overall trust in a model. So we have this categorization that is not intended to be comprehensive. 8 categories that we feel like we might see a lot in regulatory submissions, but we're not claiming that this will cover everything. Users can define, and it's really a communication tool, but users can define own categories if they want. And we provide some examples of each of these categories and some specific recommendations for each in the guidance. I'll go through some of the cases. So first, there's code verification results, which is kind of related to the question of, are there any software bugs in the implementation? Has it been, is it an accurate implementation of the underlying mathematical model? And one question involved in that is basically addressed. It's a question of, has the well, it's a code verification question, which basically asks, has the numerical scheme been implemented correctly? Is it a valid numerical scheme? Has it been implemented correctly? Does the error between the computational model and the true solution of the mathematical model decrease to 0 as you decrease your discretization tolerances, either the spatial step size or the time step? So it's addressed using these kind of convergence plots. We then introduced the idea that calibration could be relevant to overall credibility. So calibration is when you tune or fit parameters in a model to match some kind of data, and it's definitely separate to validation. It's more of a model development process, part of the model development process. But at the end of the day, when you see how well it fits or doesn't fit, that can provide supporting information for the overall credibility of a model, especially when you fit some complex phenomenon using a first principles model. Obviously, if you use a model that's very flexible in terms of the number of parameters, you can fit anything, you can overfit. But if you have a first principles model that has been shown to it's possible to calibrate to and accurately match complex phenomenon, that can be supported. Then we have the 3 different validation. Let me go into the validation categories, and we separate it into 3 different cases based on what you're comparing to, whether you're comparing to experimental data, which is usually referred to as bench data in the guidance, whether you're comparing to animal or clinical data, which is referred to as in vivo, or whether you're comparing to well, for 4 it's animal or clinical data at the individual level, and 5 population level comparison. So for bench test validation, you compare to experimental data, either and this is like what many people would think of as validation of a medical device model. Do some experiments using the actual device, whether it's energy absorption for a metallic implant, where you actually measure the absorption, or for a stent where your model predicts the deformation, fracture. You actually compress the stent in this device experimental setup and measure the force and corresponding displacement and compare that to what's predicted. Then we distinguish between this is kind of a subtle point, but we distinguish in the guidance between doing calculation verification and certainty quantification for the validation experiments and simulations versus doing it for the context of use. I won't go into that in detail, but I'll just refer you to the guidance for that. The other case is where you actually compare against animal or clinical data, and that's covered in this in vivo validation results, and we have some specific recommendations for that case. Here we're really thinking of the case where we have measurements from a specific individual, animal or human, and a model set up for that person or animal, and doing a direct comparison. There's a third case, actually, which I'll jump to before talking about this slide and come back. Then there's population validation results. And that's where this is relevant to where you have a range of patient models. So what we call a virtual cohort, a range of patient models that's supposed to span either the entire human population or the patient population for your device. And it's not possible to validate any individual virtual patient, because they either don't correspond to a real human, or data's just not available for the human it corresponds to. But it is possible to look at kind of statistics, simulate some quantity across the virtual cohort, get the distribution of that quantity, and then compare it to what that quantity looks like across the human population or across the indicated patient population. So that's a case that isn't well covered in V&V40, but we introduced here and for population-based validation results. Okay, just going back, something that we also discussed in the guidance, because it's something that can occur in regulatory submissions, is the difference between prospectively planned evidence and previously generated evidence, because often with models, you want to rely upon previously generated evidence. And there's actually 4 different cases based on whether it's previously generated or prospectively planned simulations, validation simulations, and previously generated or prospectively planned comparator data, what you're going to compare against. So we highlighted each of these 4 different cases and talked a little bit about all of them. So if you have prospectively planned everything, you're going to do some new experiments or collect new clinical data, and you're going to do new validation simulations, then that corresponds to a fully prospectively planned validation activities, which is the ideal case, but obviously the most difficult case. And we have some specific, like I mentioned, some specific recommendations. And the second case is prospectively planned validation simulations, but going to be compared against previously generated data. This corresponds to a validation against retrospective data. So, for example, comparison against literature data. In this case, where you have some previously generated simulation results and are planning new experiments to validate that, that is so uncommon that we decided it's not worth discussing. And then the last case is where everything's previously generated. So here we're kind of thinking of the case of referring to previously generated validation results, or referring to validation results that were submitted in a previous regulatory submission. So the right-hand side column, the 2 entries there, those are the cases that are not really well covered by V&V40. So we wanted to emphasize that these are possible for regulatory submissions. We don't discourage when appropriate, depending on how the model is going to be used. We just encourage, I'll get to it, but we encourage communication and discussion with the agency to decide what the appropriate activities should be for evaluating a model. So in terms of what should be submitted, we don't provide any specific recommendations. We don't say that, always submit this for this case or anything like that. But we emphasize that verification results should generally be submitted and some validation results should generally be submitted. And what validation will be submitted depends on it will likely depend on how the model is going to be used. So for a model of a medical device, it might be natural to submit code verification, category 1, and bench validation. For a model in device software, it might be natural to submit code verification and in vivo validation, kind of validating the model using clinical data. And then this idea of an encircled clinical trial, which is a little bit more right at the end of this presentation, it might be important to submit multiple evidence for multiple categories, code verification for each of the different components, bench validation data for the device model, in vivo validation for the patient model, and population validation for the cohort, for the overall cohort. Then after kind of choosing what validation is going to be, what credibility evidence is going to be collected, the guidance basically says to follow V&V40, or to at least follow the V&V40 paradigm. So it recommends defining credibility factors that are appropriate for the evidence that's been submitted. It does provide some recommendations, and in most cases it says use the V&V40 factors, but allows the user to modify the V&V40 factors or add new factors or say factors are not applicable if that's the case for their evidence. And then for each factor, define a gradation and choose a target level based on the risk assessment. And this is the easiest to be understood by through an example. So let's suppose that some bench test validation results are planned. The guidance basically says go to Appendix 1 to look up recommendations for this category 3. Appendix 1 recommends using, because this is very well aligned with V&V40, recommends using the relevant V&V40 credibility factors. So then you go to V&V40. These are the credibility factors, or as I mentioned, actually they're broken into sub-factors. But you can go to V&V40 and for each factor, define a gradation, which you can also get from V&V40. So this is the gradation that V&V40 provides as an example for this test sample sub-factor, which is essentially how many samples are you using in your experiments. And as I mentioned, the gradations kind of provide a gradations go from kind of lowest level of rigor to highest level of rigor, and the idea behind V&V40 is you can choose a level based on your overall risk assessment, or at least justify a level by referring to the overall risk assessment. So if the risk was assessed to be medium, that might be used to support this kind of medium level of rigor. So just to summarize the difference between the guidance and V&V40, in terms of credibility factors, V&V40 provides 23 credibility factors. Doesn't really talk, I think, explicitly about modifying the credibility factors or adding new ones. So, as you follow the standard, people often do feel the need to maybe rename. The guidance is explicitly flexible and says use V&V40 credibility factors if applicable, but otherwise define appropriate ones. And then V&V40, in terms of gradations, V&V40, I think, explicitly says users should define appropriate gradations, but provides examples. And actually, in practice, people just use the examples. And the guidance, again, is completely flexible. So getting towards the end of the framework now, we just have maybe a couple more slides talking about these final steps. And there's basically the process here is, well, taking a step back. Steps 4 and 5 are really about planning. We encourage, following this framework, to plan the credibility activities before actually going about evaluating a model. And then step 6 asks if the plan was executed and the credibility levels that were chosen, so level B here, and so the other credibility levels that were chosen for the other credibility factors, if those were executed according to plan, and if the results were as expected, would that be sufficient to justify using the model for the context of use? Please provide a rationale. That's basically what that step 6 is. And at that point, we recommend coming in with something called a Q submission, which is a mechanism to obtain feedback on any kind of regulatory question about a medical device from CDRH, the device center. So the kind of recommendation is to provide a Q sub saying, this is the device, this is what we're going to be using the device for. Sorry, this is what the intended use indications for use for the device are. This is a question that needs to be addressed about the device, and this is a model that's going to be used to address that question. Here is a planned credibility assessment. This is why we think it will be acceptable. Would it be sufficient? And then we can discuss and maybe refine the credibility plan or go ahead. And after going ahead, that's step 7, then we have another adequacy assessment, because there's always more information available that needs to be done. And then step 9 is about reporting, which we cover in one of the appendices for the guidance. So questions, step 6 and 8, rationale for adequacy. This basically asks, will or does the computational, depending on which step it is, does the evidence support using the model for the context use given the risk assessment? I guess I've mostly covered this slide already. Step 6 asks this manufacturers to provide a rationale for why the planned evidence with the expected results would be sufficient, and recommends coming in with a Q submission. Step 8 asks for this justification, which basically needs to be a subjective decision based on all available evidence. You can come up with pre-planned acceptance criteria, but at the end of the day, for these kind of computational models, we need to consider all the available evidence about the model, as well as all the kind of quantitative final results, and consider, is it sufficient? And the guidance has some specific considerations and ways of, and things to include in this section. Final slide on the framework. I won't go into this in detail, but Appendix 2 has a recommended structure for something that we call a credibility assessment report. And basically, this is something that could be submitted either for a Q sub or at the end in a final regulatory submission to a self-contained report on why a model is considered sufficiently credible for how it's used in the regulatory submission. And yeah, the Appendix 2 provides a recommended structure for that. This report is strictly focused on credibility of the model only, not the actual how the model is used in a simulation study. So you might ask, like, where do you submit that information, the final results? How is it related to this? And Kenny will talk about that tomorrow in the 3rd session. I'm going to end with 3 slides after this, but this is kind of wrapping up where the discussion of the guidance. This session, I think, is going to be recorded and made available. But we did do a webinar on this on the guidance in January, where we presented on the guidance and then also had a panel session with several panelists from FDA answering live questions from the audience, and that's available if you're interested at CDRH Learn. This red rectangle is actually not in the right place for some reason. It should be over the specialty topics. And then changing gears for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about something that we call regulatory science tools. So regulatory science tools are basically tools that we develop in OSEL. OSEL is the Office of Science and Engineering Labs in the Devices Center, and that's the office of maybe 200 staff members who do this regulatory science research in support of the review of the device submissions. And the main thing that we produce in OSEL are these things called regulatory science tools, which are available at this web page. I recommend going to this link or using the QR code or just Googling OSEL RST. It's a catalog of these tools that industry could use to, in some way, to evaluate a safety or effectiveness question about a medical device. And computational models. So some of the tools that have been developed are computational models, and some of the tools that have been developed are related to demonstrating credibility of computational models. So we are using the regulatory science tools framework to develop tools that support the guidance. And we're going to talk about 3 planned or released tools, regulatory science tools that will support the guidance. And the first one is a planned one. So I've gone through the guidance framework and provided kind of some idea of what would be involved by following it, but I haven't presented an end-to-end example of following the guidance. And the guidance itself, which is a very kind of big guidance, very big document for a guidance, also doesn't include any kind of end-to-end example. And what we really need are these end-to-end examples of following the process that industry can just pick up and see, okay, this is what was needed. This is an example of what was needed for step 1. This is an example of, in this case, this credibility evidence was generated. These are the credibility factors that we used, and gradations and so on. So we have a project underway to develop a series of these examples. We don't have any yet. We just started this project. Hopefully the first one will be out sometime soonish. But the first one is going to be based on a already published paper. This paper in the journal Methods, which was released earlier this year, and it's actually an end-to-end example of following V&V40. So I recommend anyone interested in V&V40 have a look at this paper. It's a very nice example of how to follow V&V40 for a spinal screw application, but it's not intended to just be for orthopedic modelers, or at least it's not. It has much broader relevance to the community because it is a nice example that can be followed, and we're going to convert that into a separate document that demonstrates how to follow the guidance using the same model and same results. Then we have a couple of workflows related to patient-specific models and in silico clinical trials, which are 2 closely related new and exciting technologies that basically the guidance is written for, in the sense that the guidance is very general, and we try to make it relevant to patient-specific modeling and in silico clinical trials. But how you exactly use the guidance for these cases is not clear. So we have released 1 RST, 1 for patient-specific models, and we'll be releasing a second one for in silico clinical trials that provides an example workflow for both of these cases that is consistent with the guidance. So for patient-specific models, it basically, a patient-specific model, as I mentioned earlier, is something that takes in patient data, generates a internal model, and then provides predictions for a clinician. This this RST is a document that basically says, here are some assumptions about how the patient-centered model works, what kind of data is collected, what kind of predictions it makes. And with those assumptions, here is a workflow that is consistent with the guidance that could be followed to evaluate it, that addresses some of the unique considerations that arise, and includes things like, this is the credibility evidence that could be collected, and these are the credibility factors and gradations that would then be appropriate. And it's not intended to be applicable to all patient-specific models. It's an example workflow that should be adjusted according to the specifics of the case, but it's hopefully a good starting point. So if you're interested in that, please go to the main RST webpage, and you should be able to find it easily. And I think a lot of people are interested in this topic. When I advertised this particular RST on LinkedIn recently, there was a huge amount of interest in the post, more than and just kind of other interest in terms of people reaching out. I was somewhat surprised. I think it made me appreciate how important patient-centric modeling is to the community, because, as I mentioned, also it's kind of related to digital twins. Then there's this example, the idea of in silico clinical trials, and a second piece of work is going to be a paper that's added at Regulatory Science Tool. That's a paper that's going to address the question of what is credibility assessment of in silico clinical trials like. What does that mean? What does verification, validation mean for in silico clinical trials? And also will provide an example workflow for evaluating in silico clinical trials based on similar to that previous one. And in silico clinical trials are much more complicated than patient-specific models, because there's so many different subcomponents that we try to capture in this image. And I'll very briefly talk about all of these different subcomponents, refer you to the paper when it comes out, hopefully before the end of the year. But it basically, for an in silico clinical trial, you have to start off with some kind of baseline patient model, and then you use clinical data and some kind of cohort generation method to develop a virtual cohort. And there's various ways of developing these virtual cohorts. You could take patient data from n different patients and use that to personalize n patient models. Each of these patient models correspond to a real human. That's what the gold will represent in this image. That could be your virtual cohort, each of them corresponding to a real human. But you can do more complicated things. You could take each of those and you could modify them in some way to maybe introduce disease conditions. So you then end up with a larger number of what we're calling synthetic virtual patients. They don't actually correspond to a real human, can't be validated against anyone in particular because they don't correspond to anyone, even though they are representative of the population as a whole. Then there's the sampling approaches, which are often used in these kind of methods, where you have some parameters and you need to sample from some distributions to generate your virtual patients. That could be, this case is the simplest one, uniform distribution, say, or for both the parameters, and you generate these synthetic patients. Or you might use virtual patients that were generated from data, from real patients, and use those to fill in the space. All sorts of possibilities, which is why it's so complicated to come up with some kind of framework for evaluating these. Then once you have a virtual cohort, you're going to evaluate some kind of device. So you need to couple the device to the virtual cohort. You might need a clinician model. Let's say that you're trying to reproduce what happens in a clinical trial that requires clinical decisions to be made in terms of how it's implanted or who it's implanted for. You might have models of other systems that are relevant. You might have an emulator, which is something that speeds up a computational model. Often with in silico clinical trials, you need to map from the physics-based quantity of interest to the clinical endpoint that you're really interested in, which is often some kind of statistical model. So that's a separate model that might be needed. That can be very hard to construct and certainly very hard to validate. And then once you have all these components, you actually can, with a study protocol, you can get the in silico clinical trial results. And then what we might also have is a integration framework for the in silico clinical trial with corresponding concurrent real world trial. Sometimes the in silico clinical trial is developed kind of instead of let's say a unethical planned, what would be an unethical in silico real world trial. But a completely different use case is having an in silico clinical trial that will run alongside a real world trial that will impact maybe when the trial ends. And there's been publications on how you might do that formally and statistically. And that then leads to an integration framework. So you have so many different components. And this paper will basically identify these components, highlight a range of in silico clinical trials that were published in the literature, talk about verification, validation, and then provide a workflow that's a sister to the previous one that I mentioned. And I want to also state that we actually will have from FDA 2 in silico clinical trial papers that will hopefully be out by the end of the year. There's a second one that's part of a broader collaboration, and we'll cover kind of we'll go deeper into some specific topics and have a good end-to-end example. So final slide, I think, yes. Final slide, so end with some summary and some key points. Talked about our guidance, which is relevant to first principles models or first principle components of hybrid models. It is not relevant to standalone AI/ML. For these models, there's a wide range of possible evaluation methods. We could spend a lot of time talking about the differences between first principles models and machine learning models and the kind of paradigms that are used to evaluate them in the relatively data sparse world that we live in with first principles models versus the hugely big data world that machine learning generally lives in. We have this framework that was developed that's kind of very general and not really quantitative in the sense that there are quantitative activities that need to be performed, but the overall framework is more of a process for communicating the activities. And that's because of the constraints that we have with first principles based models and the lack of data generally. The guidance provides a general framework relevant to all OHTs of the different offices within the regulatory side of CDRH, the devices center. So basically all different types of medical device, all submission types, and all modeling fields, at least first principles. So that makes it necessarily flexible and not prescriptive. It extends V&V40, and you can follow the guidance by following V&V40 and doing adequacy assessment. And it's a 9-step process, which starts off with some preliminary steps on how the model will be used and the risk associated with using the model. Then the prospective planning and the recommended Q submission using these kind of concepts of credibility evidence and factors and gradations, and then ends with the steps of execution and justification and reporting. And we have developed and are developing and will develop regulatory science tools that will support the guidance. I'm going to stop there, and I want to first of all acknowledge the key FDA contributors, the credibility of models, regulatory science team in OCEL is myself, Kenny Aycock, and Brent Craven. Tina Morrison, before she left CDRH, was also a very was also fundamental to the development of this guidance. I should thank all the other FDA staff members who contributed to kind of reviewing the guidance and providing feedback. I've also listed the co-authors of the interlocutor clinical trials paper or the patient-specific modeling paper that was the basis of the RST. And for resources, there's a link to the guidance, link to the webinar that I mentioned, a link to our regulatory science tools, and a comment about the interlocutor clinical trials paper. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention. I know it's getting late in the UK, and I really appreciate people sticking around to listen.
Super, Pras. Thanks a lot for helping us through these guidelines and giving it with so much detail and illustrating it. I think there is a lot of questions in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll read them out and do as you see appropriate. If you think there is anything that you you should be directed elsewhere, feel free to do so. So one of the questions is about how model calibration is defined in the context of patient-specific and population-specific modeling, which parameters need to be calibrated, which requires sensitivity analysis and uncertainty quantification.
Yeah. This is a really interesting question. It's a great question. It's a really interesting topic. Patient-specific models are interesting to me because for these models, you have a range of inputs, range of parameters, and some will be personalized and some won't be. And almost always, it won't be possible to personalize all of the parameters. And if you think of the parameters or inputs to a model as being categorized as either anatomical, material, or functional, typically we might be able to personalize the anatomical parameters, basically, like or the anatomical inputs. That's what's done with patient models that use imaging data to generate a personalized representation. And then, but it's hard to get patient-specific material properties or patient-specific parameters for the functional parameters. So those won't be personalized. They will just have population average values. And so I think it can be important to distinguish between those in terms of what you do UQ and sensitivity on. So uncertainty in the personalized parameters is especially important because the uncertainty there is related to measurement error for that particular patient. And if your outputs and the predictions are not kind of robust to that measurement error, then that could lead to a major source of unreliability, whereas the uncertainty due to those population average values could be is a kind of like a second order concern, though it's still something that's worth considering as part of model development. So I think, for that question, I would distinguish between that case.
Pras, just for those of us who perhaps are starting to get our head around some of these guidelines, is it the case that when we talk about patient-specific models, most of the times we are referring to software as a medical device? So you're thinking about a piece of software which is used as an interventional planning tool, for instance. Well, most of the times when we talk about population-specific modeling, is more about creating an environment for tests, other type of more therapeutic devices, like could be, stents or hip prosthesis. So really therapeutic devices. Or have you found other scenarios where this is, different to that mapping?
Yeah, I would say generally that's the case, with the caveats that most of the time when we talk about patient-specific models, we're talking about software as a medical device or software in a medical device, because it could be could still have a physical device that requires some modeling in the software. And then the population models are almost always used for evaluating a device. Then we're getting into the clinical trials idea. So population models, though, could be comprised of a range of patient-specific models. So there can be an overlap there. It depends on how you generate the cohort. There's kind of like two different paradigms. Well, there's a spectrum, but two different cases are where you have say data from 20 patients and you can generate 20 virtual patients and use that to evaluate the device, and each one is a patient-specific model. Or you have a modeling kind of framework and you sample parameters and you can generate 100,000 virtual patients and use that to evaluate a device. So patient models can be applicable to this to the second case, but yeah, usually I'm thinking about software as a software in a medical device.
And is it fair to say that while the guidance potentially has part that can be used in both scenarios, it was mainly designed with the second scenario in mind, so the one of using of doing validation and verification of models that are used in the context of testing devices as opposed to software as a device per se?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement. I would say that we did try and make it relevant to everything. I would say that maybe how you evaluate a software as a medical device, which has a model at its heart, patient-specific model at its heart, can be a bit tricky because you have this modeling guidance, but also you have the kind of SAMD guidance and the frameworks that have been developed for software as a medical device. You need to kind of utilize all of those.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. We have helpfully quite a bit of time, but also quite a lot of questions. So there is there a hierarchy for the 8 sources of evidence discussed for step 4? For instance, a ranking which adds more to least credibility?
Yeah, so basically we were very clear in the guidance that that was not the intent of the ranking. I mean, there are cases where you might expect certain sources of evidence to be stronger than the other. So calibration is not validation, and showing that a model fits the data very well as part of the calibration process is never going to be as strong as testing against new data. So there's certain and there's other categories of something we called model plausibility, which is basically a rationale for why the governing equations could be considered appropriate, plus a rationale for why the input parameters could be considered kind of like accurate, well measured. That might be a starting point for credibility. That's also kind of should be considered a level below validation. But we certainly don't try and rank all the different categories. We don't say anything like clinical validation is the best, is stronger than bench validation. It depends on what you're using the model for. If you're simulating a bench test and only simulating a bench test, it doesn't even make sense to do clinical validation. So yeah, there's no real hierarchy. It's more of a communication tool. It just helps kind of identify what might need to be done specifically for each of the different categories.
So super. I think there is a comment by Tina that relates in general to the way that perhaps we need to understand the difference between the ASME V&V40 and then this guidance and what was intended and not for each of them. So I'll give her a bit of a heads up and perhaps see whether she can make that point herself in a minute once she's given the chance to, we habilitate her to be able to speak. So the next question is, as part of the validation activities, how do we understand if a statistically relevant number of test samples were used? How do we define the required number of test samples to generate statistically relevant results in this context? I guess this is related to the comparators, right? That you referred to.
Yeah.
Do you have a good enough comparator or not?
Yeah, this is, I guess, a question about the language that was used in V&V40 for that gradation. That was a test samples gradation, and the gradation itself, the example gradation that was provided in V&V40 said, lowest level is single, median level is multiple but not statistically significant, and highest level is statistically significant. And I would say that, from experience with people talking about that, that particular gradation was maybe written without really thinking about, like, what does that mean to have a statistically significant number of samples in the experiments. It seems it kind of implies a very large number of experiments, and maybe doesn't really align with what might typically be done when validating a model. I can't really comment on the specifics and of what might be needed to really say it's statistically significant. But I will say that the standard is undergoing revision at the moment, and the gradations will hopefully be the gradations may well be revised to align more with what's typically done.
I mean, just to try to get my head around and understanding that maybe I may have misinterpreted the question. So I think there is how many measurements you need to do to have a good comparator. That's probably like any measurement. That's unrelated to in silico methods, right? This is just how you do proper measurements. Then there is the question about how many simulations you need to do to have assuming that simulations are taken as a measurement, and that will have to do with the compounding of the error of any input you have provided as input to the model, propagated through the model itself, that may amplify that uncertainty or not. This is aleatoric uncertainty through basically a particular model, right? So it's error propagation. And then you have the issue of, is there in addition some epistemic uncertainty in your model itself that introduces additional sources of error? So understanding how many simulations you need to be the equivalent to a measurement, I can understand that is a complex question, if that was then the other interpretation possible to this point.
Yeah, it's all part of the overall uncertainty quantification in terms of the uncertainty in the simulations and uncertainty in the experiments, and all the different potential sources of uncertainty in the experiment, including which are addressed by taking multiple measurements and also using multiple samples when you're simulating a particular device. But that particular question, I think, is a purely experimental one.
Okay, there is another question that honestly I don't understand. So unless you do, Pras, what I could do is I just move on, and maybe the person could rephrase that. So it says, is there any demo reports which we can view as reference for the 3 categories of application?
Yeah, I'm going to guess that basically, I'm not sure what 3 categories means, but if it was a reference to these different cases, or maybe the 3 categories are these 3 different cases, which are the 3 cases I had right at that beginning slide, where I had 4 cases at the beginning slide. These are the first 3 of the 4. So I mentioned that we have an ongoing project where we are trying to generate examples of following the guidance. And basically, we're going to ideally, we would slowly try and cover all these different cases. The first one, which, skipping forward, the first one, which is going to be this case, is basically that first case. There's no patient model here, just a device model. The context of use is actually replicating a particular ASTM standard test. So we will hopefully have some examples, and these will be reports. The documents that are produced will be kind of example reports in the end. That could be kind of just downloaded and not copied directly, but used as a basis for putting together a report. And then, but because the guidance is general, I want to have like a range of examples that cover these different cases, though it's not going to be, we're not going to have that immediately. It will take a little while to develop this range of examples. And I should comment that when we do release this, because we wanted something to come out quickly, we made it clear that the scope of this project is to just demonstrate the process of following the guidance only. We're not going to release something that we're going to have a very clear disclaimer that we're not making any implications about whether the methods are acceptable or whether the results would be acceptable. It's just going to be a process, but that will hopefully be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it comes very clear through your workshop and other ones that I attended from your team that this is more a way of thinking rather than exact science, and that this doesn't prevent you to have to exercise professional judgment in terms of what is the right type of sort of experiments and credibility. And that what I suppose from a regulatory point people are interested in is, have you articulated your arguments and have you provided the rationale behind whatever experiments you do, whatever decisions you make, rather than trying to say this is a hard threshold for quality, right?
I think that's a perfect answer to another question that's coming up, actually. So there's a question: how can one decide what constitutes enough evidence across the different categories? How might FDA judge this when a proposed study is submitted via QSub? And we'll swap roles for a moment, and I'll read the question and just refer to what Alex just said. That was a perfect answer. This is what's gonna be appropriate is going to be very case specific, unfortunately. So we don't try to provide specific guidelines in that respect. And V&V40 doesn't. It's again a way of structuring a conversation basically, and providing linking it to the risk. But it's going to require conversation.
Some part of me imagines that this is not extremely different in regular trials, that there is an element of how much you can go in specifying every single step, that there is a point where you have to exercise a judgment. So the next question by Neville that we see is, could CMS potentially replace a bench test called out in an FDA recognized standard and therefore replace a test result in a regulatory submission?
It's case specific and community specific, and ultimately that's where we might want to go to. And for certain devices and bench tests, especially say long running ones. So I would say yes, potentially. I don't know if the intent was, could it potentially replace it in a regulatory submission now? That's something that would have to be discussed with the relevant review team. But that's one of the biggest applications for modeling and simulation. We talk a lot about patient-specific models and in silico clinical trials, but at the MDIC meeting that some of you might have attended, we had a panel meeting with some expert industry modelers, and we had a discussion about opportunities and challenges of computational modeling for industry, and it was highlighted that there's still a lot of potential for just modeling of devices and just without even modeling patients, just modeling the bench test and reducing the amount of bench test that is needed, and kind of moving away from moving towards a more computational approach to simulating devices, to evaluating devices. Sorry.
I'm going to skip momentarily the comments from Tina. I'll come back to them at the end. But the next one is from Amin Rostami. It says, is there a formal mechanism for connecting the devices section and their use of modeling and simulation with what is done in the pharma side, OCP specifically, particularly in addressing scenarios for which not prospective study can be done within reasonable time frame, but yet information for treating such subgroups and conditions are valuable to prescribers rather than leaving them with void? if I understand Amin's point is that, and I may be inaccurate in this, so Pras, correct me if you know that what I'm saying is not correct. But I understand from conversations with Amin that there are scenarios where other parts of other regulators that are not on devices accept regulatory evidence that comes from modeling in a scenarios where it's impractical and ethical to generate that evidence through a regular approach. But otherwise, there is a pressing need for providing some answer to those groups of patients, right? Because you can just leave them in limbo, right? So is there, and I think that connects a bit with the point that Jidan is doing in the next question, which is, he was saying, I was wondering if we could use virtual patients beyond existing clinical data to expand the context of use. So going beyond context of use that are currently practical.
Yeah, for the second question, I'm not really sure that I follow as such. And I think, for all of these, it's hard to provide kind of specific answers to these kind of questions. It's always a challenge with questions about how models could be used. It always just depends. And for pharma, I want to emphasize that this is all device specific. This was a guidance that was generated by CDRH only. It's only I don't want to say only relevant to devices, but CDRH, this device center, and CEDAR are very separate organizations. And modeling and simulation has very different kind of use cases across the different centers. There, they don't really have a concept of software as you don't have modeling in the product, whereas here with devices, obviously you do. And the types of models that would be used to evaluate the product are very different types of CDRH is basically an engineering organization. CEDAR is very different. So they have their own processes, and a lot of people working in modeling and simulation in CEDAR, I would recommend looking up the CEDAR Center of Excellence for Quantitative Medicine. I think there's YouTube videos and other information that's been released about that. That's an exciting new development in how modeling and simulation is advancing in CEDAR. Combination products, which I think was being referred to, if there's a model that's being used that's relevant to both devices and drugs, then again, it unfortunately has to be considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I recognize that we are putting you to test, and there's lots of questions out here, but I think what they also highlight is two things: the importance of sessions like this, even if it's to articulate some questions, and some of them may or may not be, may not have a straight answer. But also the importance of doing a community effort of trying to find some other mechanisms of coming together in ways that, it's a safer space, both from industry, for regulators, for academics to sort of grapple with some of these challenges that in fact they don't have a white and, black and white answers. Sometimes there are new technologies that are coming, both technologies that need to be tested, technologies that we use to test, to generate evidence, and their interplay. And what is exciting is to see all of these elements coming together, right? So I appreciate, Pras, that to the extent that is possible, you're volunteering to help and to think through some of those. So I saw that there was some exchange of very interesting papers by Amin and also Tina, some of them backing and supporting your points, Pras, of the Quantitative Medicines Center of Excellence. And perhaps that's something that we might want to I'll follow up with some of you to see whether we could potentially bring some of your colleagues as well to speak more to the pharma community that we have within the Insilico UK network as well, because it's a blend of devices and pharma as well. And I think that would be quite interesting. So let me see. So I hope, Jidan, that we have answered to the extent that is possible your question. And also there is a further question from Amin or comment. Individualization in the case of medicine is related to adequate characterization on individual patient, such that the system information in the model are those of individual patients. And he provided some examples. If I understand correctly, I mean, the point you're trying to make that sometimes there we're not trying to predict the performance of a medicine in a particular individual. We're not trying to do interventional planning, right? Or medicine influence planning on a particular individual. We're trying to understand group effects or performance across subjects. And this is kind of perhaps a nuance between devices and pharma as well. I understand that Tina may not be able to have access to voice, so I'm going to read out some of the comments made. But so it's thanking you, Pras, for the informative and useful webinar, which I concur. Pras, thank you very much. It's great to see the alignment between the FDA guidance document specific for FDA use and the ASME V&V40 standard intended for a broader audience. I want to make a comment regarding the scope of V&V40 for those of you not able to view the webinar prepared for Jeff Bishop last week, the current chair of V&V40. He reiterated on these remarks that ASME V&V40 is meant to be used as a tool to help an individual team company determine the scope and rigor of validation and verification activities to be conducted or leveraged after the fact to support the use of computational models for a specific context of use. It is not meant to imply that the highest rigor of credibility is needed for any model used for medical device applications, which reflects some misinterpretation on the guidance. So what it shows is that there is a gradation, right, of things you can do, and in crescendo of potential evidence. But I think the point Tina is making is for a specific context of use or for a specific questions of interest, you might not need a full-fledged. And then there was the second point is that said, organizations are able to set for themselves and for their QMS to state what levels of rigor are needed for their internal uses, such as the way NASA uses and defines credibility levels for models used at NASA. FDA has not and will not define specific levels of rigor for specific models because everything depends on the context of use. And while the guidance provides additional details and a framework for connecting with FDA for feedback, it does not dictate which levels of rigor are needed for different model applications. These types of specific details will evolve over time as more examples are developed and made public for learning. Kudos, Pras, and the team again for the excellent job. I'm just wondering, are we perhaps here trying to be are we trying to say that things are less explicit or less clear that there are for other products and for regular methods of testing? Or am I wrong in thinking that actually there is some level of interpretation anyway in almost any source of evidence, whether it is bench, animal, or clinical trials? I mean, I can imagine just for clinical trials, for the test, there is so many things you could do in so many ways, right? That actually there is always an element of judgment that you are exercising, and that judgment may be wrong. And then when that is reviewed or scrutinized by any regulator, you may find that even doing what you thought was following standards, you may need to go and redo some experiments. So the point I'm trying to make is this very different within silico than with anything else? Or are we just trying to over scrutinize in silico?
There's a lot that can be said when we think about how we evaluate models versus how we evaluate bench tests and clinical data and animal experiments. And part of it is the history in terms of the other methods are all established, and we're trying to develop processes for models right now. And it might not be perfectly kind of consistent with how the others are evaluated, and it leads to these kind of questions of, are we evaluating models too rigorously compared to what's asked about on bench tests? That's a hard issue to address. I would say that maybe the potential, the extra flexibility that you have for performing a simulation study versus a clinical study does lead to more there is going to be some part of evaluating a clinical study. That's clear. Some subjective part of evaluating any kind of study. Maybe there's more, and that's why there's so much. Everything has to be considered case to case, case by case. Maybe there's more for a computational study compared to some of the others. But yeah, I know we've had these discussions a lot. I know it's something that's of interest to you, and how do we kind of reconcile this lack of consistency and make it a bit more even? That's a big challenge.
Or simply just accept that what we might see as a negative in terms of, oh, it looks like within silico methods there is some leniency at interpretation. Actually, it's not very different to what we're doing in other places, and that we need to start accepting and embracing that level of there is no single solution. It's not black and white. That we need to really, as a community, develop a best practice about for the specific problems how we tackle them, right? I think I understand that Tina might be able to now connect in. So if that's the case and she wants to come in, I think it would be great to bring him on board. If Nicola, if you could help me with that, that would be, and then we'll sort of use this as a way to wrap up. And
hi, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Pras, would it be possible to unshare the screen so that we can?
Yes.
That will be easier than to. Yeah. Nice to hear you, Tina. I think we don't hear you anymore.
Oh, I'm back, I think.
Yes, now you're back.
Okay. Let's see. Let me see if I can. I wasn't prepared to be on video today, but let me see if I can make that happen quickly. I did want to add some. Hi.
Hi.
So in some of your comments that you were just making about device-specific aspects too, if folks are familiar with, say, specific devices like valves or endovascular grafts, for example, there are ISO standards available for specific device areas that do lay out very specific approaches for test methods, and many of those actually include specific test methods that includes computational approaches. And there are several ASTM standards for very specific device areas, many of them in orthopedics, some of those in cardiovascular devices, that lay out very rigorous, prescriptive, methodology for what you should be doing for your computational approaches. And those are really geared to align more with bench testing approaches. But in this space of, using a model and, designing a clinical trial, enriching a clinical trial, I think it's too soon for us to lay out the prescriptiveness. And I'm really excited to see the paper from Pras and the team on what they've done for laying out a process for a hierarchical validation approach for using in silico patients or virtual patients. I think that's super exciting. When we went to the MDIC meeting several weeks ago in April, I was alarmed to hear some comments from industry that they were taking the ASME V&V40 standard as these are the levels of rigor needed for a quality management system, for example, and that for every single model that we use in-house, things that we have to send to the FDA, we needed to have our models validated at the highest rigor. And there were some comments that because of that highest rigor needed, it was slowing down model utilization. And that, for example, some model reports that used to be 20 to 50 pages were now several hundred pages because of this burden. And while I think that whatever a company chooses to do internally is certainly up to them, that is certainly not what the V&V40 standard was meant for in terms of laying out those guidelines for any one company or organization. And it's also not the purview of FDA to do that as well in the scope of this guidance document or standard. And so having heard those comments, now that the standard's been out for just over 5 years, it's great to hear the awesome feedback and incorporate those into the updates to the standard. It is certainly really important for folks to keep in mind that it was always intended to be used at this phase as a planning tool, as a discussion tool, as a way to engage with regulators. And our hope is that the other regulatory bodies will adopt a similar approach and think about how can we use this framework to have this conversation, since we don't know the right answers just yet, right? So thanks for the chance to just hear those remarks, Alex, and Pras, really great job with the overview today.
Oh, thanks a lot. And as you were explaining about some of these other standards, I wonder whether they're very prescriptive, very clear, that is an infinite precision on a very, very narrow set of use.
That's right.
And operation of the device. So there is a trade-off between how specific you are and how relevant and generalizable are the findings from those. And I think some of the flexibility that we see that is possible with modeling, and some of the, I wouldn't say ambiguity, but in definition, or in trying not to precise so much, that some of these guidance actually has to be seen as an opportunity to use this as a way to present evidence in a more comprehensive way that you would be able to do with one of those tests. Like, for instance, if you do a test of one of those valves or orthopedics implants, and you have a very specific number of cycles, a very specific conditions of testing, to what extent that represents the reality of operations in a human being. It's the test is very precise, but then the relevance or the applicability perhaps is what perhaps one could challenge there as well. And I think modeling allows you to have more flexibility in what conditions you can recreate, but therefore the guidelines need to be also more lenient to allow for that to be provided. And I think that's a bit what the guidelines as they are in principle allow you to present, right?
Yeah, fully agree.
If I may add one more comment too,
Tina, you got on mute.
Sorry about that. I think there's another opportunity, and that is, you as a company or a team, you have this framework in front of you that allows for this conversation about decision making, looking at something that isn't explicit in either the standard, and I don't think in the guidance either, is this discussion around the level of confidence you have in any source of evidence that's in front of you. So if you have your context of use, and as a part of the discussion, you're saying, okay, what other sources of evidence do I have on the table in front of me that can support this question of interest alongside this computational model? If I were on that team, I would be saying, okay, well, here's our bench test. Here's what our bench test gives us, or here's what our animal study gives us. Here's what we'll get from our clinical trial. What's the level of confidence that we have in those different sources of evidence? Where are the sources of uncertainty? And is there a way for us to look at all the evidence on the table for a specific decision and decide, okay, for this case, actually modeling is not the best approach. Or maybe in this scenario, because it gives us the most flexibility, even if our confidence is a little bit lower, we might learn more. So I think there's an opportunity to not just be prescriptive and saying, here are all the different levels needed to support a model's utility. I think you can actually extend the framework to all the different models you have in front of you and ask the questions about confidence, uncertainty, and influence as a team, and use that to make business decisions. And I hope that is what happens as a part of the community of industry folks that put together that in silico technologies paper to kind of communicate and say, hey, this isn't just about any one model. This is really the opportunity to have a discussion about all the sources of evidence in front of us, and maybe the opportunities for in silico, and maybe in some cases it's not.
Super, that's really great. And with that, on that note, I want to thank you both, Pras and Tina as well, for joining into the conversation at the end.